Thank you. Yes, this this particular paper was spawned when I was towards the end of writing my dissertation. I found this really peculiar and interesting footnote where Bergson sort of summarizes the entire kinship and difference between his philosophy and the philosophy of Plotinus. So this is kind of a series of reflections and thoughts that have culminated for the better part of a year, just meditating kind of on this one footnote. So I'm excited to share this research. So I'll begin now. Henri Bergson was, in many ways, the modern heir of the Platonian philosophy, perhaps his only other rival for this title being Schelling. Bergson defended a spiritualist philosophy, and by this, I mean a philosophy that plainly acknowledges the existence of invisible realities and admits that these realities, not in spite of, but rather thanks to their empirical imperceptibility, are moreover capable of being apprehended, discerned, and described by the reflective mind, which itself shares the same species of dynamic, interpenetrating, and non-spatial existence. Bergson, after all, lists Plotinus among his few inspirations. He was once quoted saying, "I am certain that I owe a profound debt only to two or three philosophers, Plotinus, Maine de Biran, and a little bit to Ravesson." End quote. Bergson's main convergence with Neoplatonic philosophy is found in the fact that both he and Plotinus attempt to account for 1. The spiritual source of the human mind, 2. The pure presence and immediate perception of it, 3. The existence and nature of invisible dynamic realities to the best of our human capacity, and 4. Supreme love, or for Plotinus, a superabundance which is at the very least not antithetical to love, as their reigning source. To achieve a metaphysical vision of this kind, the method which both Plotinus and Bergson follow is what we may call the method of introspection, sometimes known as intuition or reflection. The introspective method claims to result in a direct knowledge of the mind by itself, in an immediate vision of the spiritual as pure presence, implicit, enveloping, constitutive, and of another order than the data that it integrates. For both thinkers, this reality is accessed by a kind of effort, by a conversion of attention, an act of self-recovery, a kind of remembering or recollecting of ourselves, and by a progression of this inner knowledge from darkness to light. For both Bergson and Plotinus, to penetrate the inner regions of the conscious mind via a direct, intuitive perception is at once to enter into the domain of metaphysical truth itself. In her influential doctoral dissertation comparing these philosophies, Rosemarie Mosset-Bastide writes that Bergson made Plotinus, quote, "the inventor of a method of interiorization which penetrates metaphysical reality via psychological experience, whence derives the parallelism Bergson establishes between the process of thought and the process of life, and the value he accorded to intuition." End quote. That being said, we nevertheless find that at every opportunity, Bergson attempts to avoid methodologies which abjure the sensible on their way to the contemplation of the intelligible. In other words, he is not an idealist. The present state of exile and ignorance in which the soul finds itself can be remedied if we place ourselves under our own introspective gaze. But importantly for Bergson, to do so also requires that we apprehend ourselves as actors and agents in the world of time and history. So, we might say that Bergson's philosophy, like the philosophy of Plotinus, is indeed a spiritualist philosophy, and yet his philosophy is a spiritualism which is also a personalism. According to Bergson, a philosophy of spiritualism which is also a personalism will not see reason as the exclusive hallmark of man. For reason, the intelligence, the idea, whatever it is you wish to call this principle, is really the same, one and indivisible in diverse minds. There is no other mark of interiority which would serve to distinguish Peter from Paul. Hence, we find the idea recurring throughout the history of philosophy of an impersonal world soul from which all individual souls are said to originate and to which they must ultimately return. If we lose individuality and personality in our attempt to define the spiritual nature of mind, then we are better off defining the spiritual nature of mind according to a mixed principle, to an intelligence penetrated with and not divorced from sensibility. In accordance with this vision, Bergson comes to develop a theory of intelligence which he believes starkly opposes the Greek metaphysical tradition, of which he erects Plotinus as the exemplar. How then does Bergson find himself both bearing the torch of the Neoplatonists in the modern world, and yet also sees himself as radically rupturing this inheritance? In my own attempts to answer this question, I have found that we ought to concern ourselves primarily with Bergson's revision of the Platonian Logos. In a particularly fascinating passage of creative evolution, Bergson gives us a rather curious footnote which I believe holds the key to both understanding and resolving the tension between Bergsonian and Platonian thought. In the section of creative evolution in which this note appears, Bergson is in the process of elaborating a highly speculative and deeply metaphysically complex account of the ideal genesis of matter as an inversion or interruption of mind or consciousness. He describes how the human mind is capable of alternating between a pure concentration of its own consciousness, an indivisible activity and impulsion of the will, and a scattering of this attention into disinterested and fragmented images. He uses the example of listening to a poet as he reads aloud his verses. We are very well capable of simply listening to the poem, of sympathizing with its inspiration, of feeling the mood and grasping the idea of the poem by inserting ourselves in the continuous movement of the lecture in an undivided act. But if we were to relax this effort, if we were to relax this tension or attention of the mind, we would begin to hear the individual phrases, and then the individual words, and then the sounds that make up these words. Up until this point, these elements had been blended together so as to form a melodic continuity. But now we're capable of seeing them as parts, as elements. We see them scatter themselves and divide themselves up. The more that our mind lets go of this internal tension, the more the sounds which make up the poem become individuated, to the point where we can begin to find an infinity of complex relations between any two syllables. In fact, this is what we've trained machines now to do with large language models. In other words, the mind can disengage from the whole, its atomistic and isolated parts. Bergson uses this example to show how the mind implicitly possesses the idea of space, understood as a pure mutual exteriority, in the idea that it possesses of its own possible detension or extension. Transferring this psychological example to the cosmological metaphysical plane, Bergson hypothesizes that to arrive at matter from the initial impulsion of consciousness which brings it into the world would consist in following the same direction of extension and pushing the inverse of the movement of consciousness up to its furthest point. Suddenly, at the end of this rather fascinating and complex description, Bergson interrupts himself with the following aside. Our comparison does no more than develop the content of the Logos as Plotinus understands it. For while the Logos of this philosopher is a generating and informing power, an aspect or fragment of the Psyche, on the other hand, Plotinus sometimes speaks of it as a discourse. More generally, the relation we establish in this present chapter between extension and detension resembles in some aspects that which Plotinus supposes, some developments of which must have inspired Monsieur Ravaisson, when he makes extension not indeed an inversion of original being, but an enfeeblement of its essence, one of the last stages of the procession. Yet ancient philosophy did not see what consequences would result from this for mathematics. For Plotinus, like Plato, erected mathematical essences into absolute realities. Above all, it suffered to be deceived by the purely superficial analogy of duration with extension. It treated one as it treated the other, regarding change as a degradation of immutability, the sensible as a fall from the intelligible. Whence, as we shall show in the next chapter, a philosophy which fails to recognize the real function and scope of the intellect. End quote. There's a lot to unpack here. There is, in point of fact, an entire philosophical genealogy contained in this ostensibly casual digression. First, we can begin by noting that Bergson here places his own theory of the genesis of matter within the tradition of the Platonian theory of procession. Broadly speaking, the idea of procession maintains that every incarnation, every embodied thing, comes about via a passage from the unextended to the extended, from the less realized to the more realized, from the immaterial to its materialization, from the indivisible to the divisible, from the whole to the parts, from the mutually interpenetrating to the mutually exterior. In particular, The reality of the living being or the biological organism forces us to appeal to a spiritual and indivisible source as its necessary explanation. For the explanation provided by the mechanistic or materialistic philosophy fails entirely to give an account of the source of life itself, of the fundamental unity and organization that characterizes all living beings. In the case of living beings, corporeal extension reveals a certain unity which comes about for Plotinus from the logos spermaticos, the immanent principles which guarantee that each part of the organism develops in function of the whole, so that the whole can be said to remain immanent within its parts. Beneath the organismic world, at the level of inert or inorganic matter, this immanent unity begins to disappear, so that each part becomes juxtaposed and external to the others, and can consequently be said to be contained within the whole. Extended forms are thus to living forms what cadavers are to living beings, an aggregate that has lost all unity, a scattering of extension which has begun to lose its organizing principle. But, notes Bergson, Plotinus fails to recognize, quote, what consequence this theory of procession would result in for mathematics, end quote. In other words, Bergson appears to be saying that there is a fundamental contradiction in Plotinus between his conception of mathematics, insofar as he, in Bergson's estimation, quote, erects mathematical essences into absolute realities, and his conception of geometric space or pure extension as the final step of the procession of the one. Before we explore this criticism further, let us first ask, what is the role of the logos in this procession? For Plotinus, the logos signifies language and reasoning, and it also implies the role of an actor. The role of the logos is to unfold something unified at a higher level of reality into multiplicity at a lower level. The logos is the thing or principle which brings spirit to matter, the indivisible to the divisible, thought to extension. And language is obviously a most useful model for this, insofar as language is the multiplicitous, variegated, and indeed inadequate equivalent of a single incorporeal thought. Similarly, discursive reasoning is the multiplicitous equivalent of a single intuition. For the human mind, both language and reasoning unfold something which is already present, like how an actor must recite his lines in order to play his role. Thus, the human mind or soul is the logos of intellect because it unfolds an internal idea. The metaphysical role of the logos takes place in the cosmos and is applicable to the descendant layers of reality, or the hypostases. Thus, each hypostasis is said to be the logos of its superior. The world is the logos of soul, soul is the logos of intellect, and intellect is the logos of the one. Porphyry, in his sentences, gives us the following summary of this view, quote, certainly, everything is in everything, but in a manner befitting the essence of each reality. For in the human mind, the principles or logoi exist intelligibly. In the soul, they exist as reason. In plants, they exist spermatically. In bodies, they exist as reproduced images. But in the beyond, they exist inconceivably and above all substance, end quote. In effect, Bergson and Plotinus agree that the categories of the material universe are mutual impenetrability, a reciprocal exteriority of parts, and a disunity or discohesion owing to the genesis of space or extension. Soul uses material extension to express itself in the world. For, writes Plotinus, quote, if there were no body, soul would not proceed forth, since there is no other place where it is its nature to be. But if it is going to proceed, it will produce a place for itself, and thus a body, end quote. Matter is thus the principle of expression for soul, just as language is the principle of expression for thought. There is, however, one critical difference here between the Platonian and the Bergsonian conceptions of matter. For Bergson, the extreme limit of matter, a pure geometrical extensity, is never in point of fact reached. Matter points towards a pure exteriority without actually reaching this limit. In reality, matter for Bergson is a qualitative and not a purely geometrical continuity of what Bergson calls extensity rather than extension, in which each material point does, in fact, interact with the other parts and so influences the whole. It is even, as 20th century physics was to show, and which Bergson rather prophetically intuits, a vibrational continuity endowed with a certain blind rhythm. It is only the intelligence which then confers to this universal and ongoing transformation the stability and solidity of the atom, the infinitely divisible point on a line, the static, stable figure which we never actually encounter in experience. For Plotinus, on the other hand, nature itself does reach this limit of pure pulverization, up to the point of coinciding with the infinitesimal, with the infinity of endless division. Matter, as for Plato and Aristotle, is at the very least the logical equivalent of non-being. For Plotinus, this final terminus of procession, space, must exist necessarily precisely because of the fact that we can establish it by reasoning, from which it follows that matter is, among the Greeks and among the idealists more largely, a metaphysical zero. It is the negation of being for the very fact of being its terminus. Thus, we find, in the famous allegory of Plato's cave, the idea that the material universe is smoke and mirrors, that we inhabit a world of contradiction and illusion which must be escaped. And like the enlightened prisoner, we must engage in a mental conversion from the perception of the sensible to the contemplation of the intelligible. Hence, the Platonic mood which sees the world of time, matter, and history as scandalous, irrational, and negative. For Bergson, the material universe, even if it be degraded, nevertheless maintains its cohesion, continuity, and duration. Above all else, this world is real in spite of its apparent contradictions, and to convert our attention from the lower to the superior does not involve that we fly from the sensible, but rather that we more concretely insert ourselves within it. The big problem, which I actually don't really talk about very much in this paper, but I'm hinting to it now, is that Bergson takes issue with the Platonic theory of time and its corresponding worldview of determinism. Quote, with supersensible ideas and an infrasensible non-being, you have to reconstruct the sensible world. This is Bergson writing. You can only do so if you postulate a kind of metaphysical necessity in virtue of which the confronting of this all with this zero is equivalent to the affirmation of all the degrees of reality that measure the interval between it and nothing, end quote. Everything thus appears to be given, once and for all eternity. Where is the room here for the free and loving creator? Where is the room for the free and loving human being? Where is the room for time and change as the means to the conversion both of the individual man and of the human race entire? And here again do we finally approach the critique of mathematics. In Plato's Meno, mathematics is used as a propedeutic to an ascent to the absolute, insofar as it reveals the fundamentally intelligible order or ideal structure which is not learned from our encounter with the senses. Geometry is the paradigmatic example of intelligence acting according to its own principles. Correspondingly, reason is established by Plato and Aristotle as the superior hallmark of man which distinguishes man from the lower animals. It is the defining feature of his spiritual nature. By contrast, Bergson is often, mistakenly I might add, accused of being an anti-intellectualist. I'd say see Russell's critique, for example, and the defense of Karen Stephen, who is actually Russell's protege, who provided a very interesting sort of analytic philosophy defense of Bergson's epistemology. For Bergson, the function of intelligence is to preside over actions. He famously says in Creative Evolution that intellect is given to man as instinct is given to the insect. Human intelligence is designed to act. Its goal is action. Its biological embodied reality means that it cares to survive. It is thus not concerned with action itself, action in general, but more specifically with the ends of action, with the possible stops that our body may take in relation to the world, with the potential moments of arrest of our moving life and time. For this reason, writes Bergson, quote, all the operations of our intellect tend to geometry, as to the goal where they find their perfect fulfillment. It is evident that it is a latent geometry, immanent in our idea of space, which is the mainspring of our intellect and the cause of its working, end quote. The work of intelligence is abstraction, precisely because this abstraction is necessary for a conscious being which has been precisely tuned and adapted to act upon matter. Abstraction is certainly fascinating and interesting, and it is certainly some sign of our superiority in the hierarchy of living beings, insofar as it reveals the living impetus within us which seeks to charter, master, and manipulate the world to our own end. Now, when man transcends this intelligence, when he grasps back after the source and spirit that sits behind intelligence and pushes it into the foreground, when man apprehends by intuition, when he sees things not in the manner of the logician, but of the poet, or as the inventor, is when man, for Bergson, is properly exercising the most spiritual of his faculties. And this superior intuition, which, by the way, Plotinus also acknowledges as a superior mode of knowledge, and he is, after all, a contemplative mystic, the superior intuition does not, for Bergson, require that we quit our temporal lives, but rather that we yield our activity more indivisibly and purely within it. Let us be clear, for Bergson as well as for Plotinus, there is no debate over the origin of mathematics. It is not constructed from experience. It is, in fact, a kind of a priori intuition of the mind. It is just that, Bergson clarifies, this a priori intuition is nothing else but, quote, the mind's intuition of space, end quote. And it has an intuition of this pure spatiality because it is simply gazing upon its own possible detention, its own furthest possible point of relaxation. As Moshe Bastide writes, quote, in Bergson, mathematics always represents a detention of the élan vital and its materialization. However, it also bears in itself a kind of intelligible archetype, the a priori idea of space, end quote. In other words, we make abstraction out of empty space. Empty space, defined as the scheme of infinite divisibility, is the material for our intellectual abstraction. And, continues Moshe Bastide, this abstraction juxtaposes within an ideal space that which experience gives in reciprocal implication, end quote. Geometrical space is thus the result of the mind's transmutation of material extensity, but a transmutation that is not holy or mysterious, a transmutation that is not alchemical nor magical, but rather that is one of a slight transference of state, a slight sliding up the scale, similarly to a liquid changing its form to a gas. But now let us be clear again. Plotinus also has his own very complex philosophy of mathematics, which allows for different degrees of magnitude and different degrees of sensibility. For Plotinus, too, there exists a pure extension, a diagram of homogeneous division, which soul casts upon the world in order to imprint itself there. This is found in Plotinus's deeply interesting and complex discussion of intelligible magnitude or size at Aeneid 3:6, 18. Matter, in coming into being, quote, still preserves its own nature and makes use of this intelligible magnitude or size like a cloak which it wrapped around itself as it ran with it when extension led it on its course, end quote. This pure extension is, quote, a form and not a receptacle, end quote. It is ideal or imaginary insofar as it hovers between the realm of the intelligibles and the realm of material creation. Because I have already done some research on the relation of Bergson's and Plotinus's theory of procession as it relates to the act of poetic invention and human artistic creation, and for that you can see one of my essays if you're interested in that subject, I think that we can go ahead and make the following comparison. Pure geometric extension is almost like the language of objects. These indivisible points ideally make up the extensity that we encounter in reality. This space acts as a kind of map for material extensity. It is as if an impenetrable point, defined as a variable in relation to other points, whose position may be ideally grasped as well as traced and even measured to the point of its being able to accurately reflect the laws of the physical and natural world, as shown by the work of Renaissance and post-Renaissance science. It's as if these points are akin to words, or rather, they are akin to the sounds that make up the words. They are like the b and m of human language. Extension develops the thought of matter, the idea of matter. This is the Neoplatonists. Says Bergson, extension develops the will behind the thought of matter, or still more accurately, the consciousness behind the creation of matter. Again, referring to the example of poetry, The diagram of empty space is like the image which precedes the poet's choice of word. It is the image which precedes the following string of syllabic utterances. In another compelling image from Plotinus, he calls empty space the father of matter. Matter exists as its image. And so, writes Plotinus, what goes forth, matter, from the expressed principle in the intelligible world, the idea of space, already has a trace of what it is going to come to be, end quote. Thus, this intelligible geometry, far from being the equivalent of sensible geometry, is rather its origin and source, just as the one is the origin of intelligence and intelligence is at the origin of the soul. For Bergson, mathematics still communes with the intelligible side of reality in a similar way. We are mathematicians because we possess an intuition of extension. And the world itself does, to an astounding degree of success, conform itself to mathematical laws and calculations. So, in apprehending mathematical truths, we are apprehending something of the spiritual ordering within and behind creation, a logoic principle, even perhaps. But this intuition of extension is, again, the intuition of the mind's own possible detension. So, what we can have is the intuition of mathematics as the intuition of the consciousness immanent to the creation. But it is the intuition of consciousness at its own limit, not the intuition of consciousness in its full force. And here is where we can finally come to understand Bergson's new meaning of the logos. What then, asks Bergson, is the principle that has only to let go its tension, may we say, to detend in order to extend, the interruption of the cause here being equivalent to the reversal of the effect? For want of a better word, he answers his own question, we have called it a consciousness, end quote. Bergson replaces the Platonian logos with his famous élan vital, a creative consciousness, a vital force or impetus, a poussée of the will. Hence, as we discussed earlier, why Bergson does not accept the Platonic belief that matter is nothingness. Matter is not the necessary conclusion of an initial axiom, but it is rather the vehicle of creation and itself the result of a creative act. To create life or consciousness, the creative force or élan had to express itself in the world of extension. The invisible reality makes the visible, not by a kind of automatic and necessary diminution of its essence, but by the result of its willing the world into being, as the word or breath from the mouth of the speaker expresses an original, indefinable thought. Keep in mind that for Plotinus, as noted here by Jean Trouillard, quote, the logos is an order, not a person. It is not equivalent to its principle. It does not incarnate nor gather together men. The word of Plotinus is very far from coinciding with the Christian logos, end quote. With Bergson, it's almost like we have a philosophical description of the Christian idea of the logos, of the same philosophical type as the kind we might find in, for example, Origen or Augustine, the idea of the logos as God immanent or God in relation to the lower order, but without the full dogmatic identification of this principle with Christ. Instead, we get a principle identified with the élan that is creative and free, that is essentially a consciousness, that is to say, a supreme personality, whose creative force supremely manifests itself as love, insofar as love is the impetus behind all acts of creation, all true acts of creation, and so bears a certain kinship and direct lineage with our own creative will. Which leads me to pose the following question to scholars of both ancient and modern philosophy as well as of the early church. Could Bergson be thought to offer the way of reconciliation between the metaphysics of the Christians and of the Neoplatonists? So, in conclusion, what is Bergson's new logos? The élan vital, both consciousness and will. It is the side of an acting, an active personality, a will which is at its upper limit a superabundant love, which in the median realm of nature and the cosmos is a creative force, and which in man, in the conscious being, expresses itself as freedom and liberty. Mathematics is still a clue of the intelligible, but it is not a means of ascent to the absolute as it was for Pythagoras or for Plato. The mind will find, at the upper limit of its élan, in a pure bursting forth of love and desire, its fusion with the divine creative love, above all thought, division, and representation. For the absolute in Bergson's philosophy is not outside of us. Rather, it is more interior to us than our innermost self. Once it has arrived at this point of coincidence, the soul no longer has to take a detour by way of eidetic analysis or conceptual mediation to discover its source. There is no longer, in other words, a disassociation between thought and being. The mind which knows itself will certainly, by the same act, come to know its limits, but it need not remain blind to that which limits it. This progressive discernment of the metaphysical by way of the psychological, moreover, will result immediately in a regeneration of the will and activity of the person, rather than in a merely passive mode of contemplation detached from all practical displays of love and charity. All the great mystical writers agree on this point, that the immediacy of divine intuition leads to a simplicity of action. And with this, we can understand Bergson's anti-Platonianism when he claims that contemplation is actually a diminution of activity and not the other way around. That's the end of the paper. Thank you so much. I think I can't hear you guys at the moment.
Well, Victoria, thank you very much for your extremely rich and thought-provoking paper. Just to kick things off, I mean, presumably one of the obvious differences between Bergson and I think one of the reasons why your paper is so interesting is clearly Bergson had this enormous influence, of course, on subsequent French philosophy, and we know that Plotinus was such an important figure for him. So in a way, Plotinus via Bergson is clearly a presence in French philosophy in perhaps rather surprising ways. But one obvious difference would be not so much the doctrine of the Logos that you've been discussing in such an admirably lucid way, but presumably the concept of the idea of what we might take the first principle or as God in birth. I mean, Bergson is presenting one of the classic instances of a God of becoming that is obviously in opposition to the Platonian model of absolute one.
Yeah, and I think that what's really interesting, I mean, obviously the influence of Bergson on the remainder of 20th century French thought is just so important and so understudied. And for me, what's particularly fascinating is how you have a revival of really all kinds of sort of later Roman philosophy through Bergson as well. I mean, he was a professor of ancient philosophy at the Collège de France before he was made the professor of modern philosophy. And he gave a series of highly influential lectures on Plotinus, which are available for purchase in French if you read French. One of his students was Émile Bréhier, who was then responsible for translating Plotinus into French and providing the sort of canonical interpretation of Plotinus for French scholarship of the mid-20th century. And also you find Augustinian scholars who seized upon the living inspiration in Bergsonian thought and found and were able to kind of recover within Augustine's own reflections on time and memory these truths that had sort of been left aside in the 19th century in France due to the taint of Jansenism upon Augustinian scholarship. So there's a lot of fascinating food for thought there with that question. I think that Bergson's really interesting because he's attempting to take philosophy to its farthest possible place without theology or faith. He's attempting to, he actually sort of what he works backwards in a way from the direction of thousands of years of thought beforehand, which began with the first principle, which began then post Christian revelation with recognizing this first principle as a person, or rather three persons, which began with the dogmatic identification. And he sort of is able to get back to a personal source behind all of reality through a reflection on the nature of the human mind, and specifically through a reflection on what he calls duration, which is this idea that we live in time, and a time which is not self-annihilating, a time which is not composed of instants, a time which, in point of fact, is not analogous in any way to space, but is rather this pure symphonic accumulation in which the past endures within the present, and of which the human mind or human consciousness is especially made to be its primary witness, insofar as we reflect the passage of time mysteriously through our memory, and also we anticipate and, in fact, co-create the impending dimension of time, which is the future, through our own creative will. So, where Bergson really is able to diverge from the kind of Neoplatonic spiritualism is in his ability to not see everything as this kind of immutable, eternal plan onto which the world is rather poorly mapped. And he's able to kind of recover conversion or recover the immediate perception of the absolute within the human person's own conscious experience of the world, of his own individuality, of his life, his or her life in time. And that's really where the critique and creative evolution of Plotinus and of Greek metaphysics in general comes about in chapter 4.
I'm sure we've got a lot of questions, particularly in relation to that last point we were just making about experience, not least because Plotinus has his own very interesting account of experience. But so I've got Greg and Matthew and Matthias.
Why don't you go first? No, please. So I don't really know about Psalm, but you mentioned Jean Trouillard, and I love Jean Trouillard's work, but when I read his stuff, and I've read a lot of stuff, it seems to me that he, the entire level of nous drops out, and he portrays Proclus as if there's an immediate relation between the one and soul. And my guess is because he's sort of afraid of ontotheology, and Heidegger's completely false false account of what it is to have being as a being. So it sounds, I guess my question is, in Plotinus, between the one and an individual soul, there's the hypostasis of soul, right? Which is what takes the forms and makes this world that we live in, yeah? And there's nous, which is not static and dead, it's completely alive, right? So in Berson, what holds the place of nous, or is he also afraid of ontotheology in some way and wants an immediate relation between the individual and the one?
That is such a good question. Wow, yes, what takes the place of nous in Bergson? Such a beautiful question. I would say that what takes the place of nous is actually the will. And so I think Bergson is a kind of voluntarist in a way. I think that the creative will, that the one, if we're thinking about it at the one, if we think about this as God, or we think about this as, a source which is a willing personal source in the sense of not just an abstract idea. If we think about the one in that dynamic way, then what faces the world, what faces the world at the top of this triangle is this side of the one that is pure willing or pure creation. And then that is what kind of unfolds itself according to, actually, here we have an interesting thing in Bergson, according to what he calls a dynamic scheme or dynamic schemas, plural. And that really might be the equivalent of logoi for Bergson. And at least in the psychological case, in the case of a poet generating a poem or an artist generating an image, before we create something, we have the sketch of the composition that we're going to create. And this sketch is indivisible, it's obscure, sometimes it's just a sentiment, a desire, a feeling, and we have to then render it into material extension. So maybe we could say that the creative will is kind of descending into the world and needs to create within the world, but it's doing so according to some idea that it has of what it is that it wants to create. Now, Bergson also has this very fascinating critique of the idea of divine ideas, essentially, in his essay called The Possible and the Real, where he really wants to abjure our kind of, or reject our tendency to overly reify or materialize these ideas into sort of full-blown artifacts before their creation, because we can't help to look at something and say there was an idea before this thing that was the equivalent of the thing. Now, with something like a painting or a portrait, there is the idea that precedes the painting or the portrait. But until the portrait is made, the idea is not the equivalent of the portrait. The idea, if anything, is the equivalent of the artist who desires to create the portrait. So we have to be careful with Bergson too. We can't really have the ideas plural because if nous for Plotinus is consists in many ideas, an infinite amount, in fact. We can't have the ideas pre-containing the reality itself. They can be on the road to reality, but they can actually indicate the things that come to be, because then we would have, again, determinism, which is really the supreme problem that Bergson is trying to avoid. And just one more thing is that Triade, like I love what you said about, reading him. And I just find that when you're reading French scholars, especially in the 20th century in theology or in philosophy, you're reading not really like a pure work of scholarship. You're reading basically an entire philosophy. So like Triade's interpretation of Plotinus is very much Triade's interpretation of Plotinus. I wouldn't take it as the representation of Platonian thought, but for all that reason, because the French can't help but being so creative and just making up their own philosophy in the process of scholarship, for that reason, do you get so many interesting, fruitful insights in reading someone like Triade?
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. So Matthew and then Matthias.
That's an excellent pivot to go to my question, which you really kind of started to answer. Because what I was thinking as I was listening to your paper are sort of these two lineages in Bergson, and you bring out his competencies and his heritage in classical philosophy very, very well. You have Breillet and all of this, and you sort of heir to a certain kind of French interpretation of ancient philosophy. But there's the whole, and you brought it up very quickly in the beginning, the whole tradition of philosophie réflexive that begins with Maine de Biran and Lachelier, Le Cuyer, Lagneau, and in a way, Bergson is kind of the end of this French tradition. It sort of stops with him, and after him, there's phenomenology and Bergsonianism. Yeah. And so I was wondering, since introspection is kind of the key word for that, I wonder where these influences bump up and maybe come to loggerheads at some point in Bergson, the sort of Maine de Biran and this introspective method, and then his way of reading Plotinus. I think you might have already answered it in a way when you came to this voluntarism, which is so French 19th century idealist, the voluntarism of a Maine de Biran. Maybe you could continue to flesh that out, where these two traditions kind of hit up against each other.
Absolutely. I think it's at the moment when he decides to undertake the research for creative evolution. So up until that point, well, Bergson's very interesting because he combines the Biranian introspective method, which really, by the way, is also influenced by Pascal and then goes back from Pascal to Augustine, right? That's a whole Western philosophical tradition inspired by the Christian tradition, which results in someone like a Maine de Biran. He takes the Biranian introspective method and he also marries it to this very, mid to late 19th century method of philosophizing about scientific empirical data, which is what you see in his contemporaries at the École Normale Supérieure, people like Jules Lachelier, who wrote a very fascinating dissertation on the contingency of the laws of nature, and also to a degree, Ravesson. So you find this kind of concern, or Émile Boutroux is another one that was really very much concerned with integrating and providing an interpretation of empirical data. So Bergson was a mathematician before he decided to become a philosopher. In fact, he was a prodigal mathematician. And so he's always thinking about the facts. He's concerned with the facts as they reveal themselves in our observation of our own selves, as well as in the natural world around us, and the facts as they are determined and determinable by science and observation and experimentation. But I think the main turning point where he moves sort of from the purely sort of intuitive psychological concern to this more cosmological, grand metaphysical, really what looks like an exercise in traditional speculative metaphysics, which we all thought would be impossible after Kant. He really makes that turn in creative evolution where he decides to look at the facts of biology and the natural world and to determine whether the hypothesis of mechanism could be true, could possibly be true. And he's sort of asking after, well, it's all fine and good to look at the mind and to recognize the mind as spiritual, to recognize this sort of brute efficacy or brute force of the will, which is non-physical, which characterizes the human mind. But what is the source of that mind itself? Where does that mind come from? How is it all related? And then how is it related to sort of the smallest speck of dust or the smallest grain of matter? And I think that's where the two traditions come to be married, because he's now not only looking at the facts like a scientist, he's not only thinking about things according to his method of introspection and his method of duration, but he's also engaging in a highly speculative metaphysics, which comes knowingly to sort of both reuptake and also revise the Greek project of metaphysics.
Thank you very much. Then finally, Bunty.
It would be good to move to the second.
I was also, but I didn't want to exclude you. Okay. Thank you very much. So.
Thank you so much, everybody. And again, sorry I couldn't be there and hope to be able to meet you all at some point in the future.